This is Someone Like Me, In Slavery Tennessee's podcast working to educate listeners about the realities of human trafficking and empower survivors of this crime by telling their stories. I'm Leslie, your host. When victims of sex trafficking are brought into the court system, it's usually for a charge or charges that are unrelated to the trafficking itself. Instead, it's often because of things like drug charges or other crimes that are wrapped up in trafficking and the lifestyle it sets up for these victims. Many court systems across the United States have set up programs to identify those coming through on unrelated charges who may need help with an underlying issue like mental health, veterans' needs, addiction, and trafficking. They call these treatment courts, and there are several in the United States that are designed specifically to address human trafficking. In Nashville, the human trafficking court is called Cherished Hearts. It's a 2-year program involving hands-on communication with the presiding judge, assistant district attorney, and a host of local community service providers that can assist with managing the various needs of a survivor. It's often way more personal than what you may think of as a court. They meet together often and are given resources to help with stability. Within the Cherished Hearts Court are 2 other day-long programs called Grace Empowered and the John School. You may remember our episode last season with a volunteer at the John School. It's a really interesting perspective about the consequences for men who are paying for sex. Now, the Grace Empowered program provides women who have prostitution charges an opportunity to get those charges removed through a day-long program which addresses things like trafficking, addiction, and trauma. In Slavery Tennessee is incredibly involved in this program, as we know that prostitution is often paired with and related to trafficking. It's this collaboration with Cherished Hearts, Nashville's Human Trafficking Court, that's an important part of the In Slavery Tennessee referral process. It helps in identifying persons eligible for the comprehensive services provided by In Slavery Tennessee's care coordinators, which includes walking with survivors through complex legal issues many of them have. So in today's episode, producer Stacy Elliot and I talked to Judge Anna Escobar and Assistant District Attorney Sarah Wolfson about how the court system can help victims of human trafficking.
Okay, let me start with the first would you rather. Would you rather be completely invisible for one day or be able to fly for one day?
I mean, that's easy for me. I would rather be able to fly for a day.
And why? What?
Well, I would just go all the places that, bop around, maybe take a little pit stop in Hawaii and have myself a nice day. And technically, then I will be invisible. No one will know where I am.
Ooh. She pivoted that. She pivoted.
Look
at
that.
Yes. Look at that.
Man.
Brilliant. Mm-hmm.
Sarah, you took all the creativity out of that. I wouldn't rather be invisible because I wouldn't want to know what people are thinking about me. I would rather fly around too, just to have a day from me so I could see all the things that I've always wanted to see.
Would you rather all traffic lights be green or never have to stand in line again?
All traffic lights be green because I need help getting places on time.
Mine is never have to stand in line again.
Okay.
Because I can sit in my car and listen to a podcast or music all day, but like me standing in line it's the shuffling from one foot to the other, and it's the people are getting too close to you, and I can't. That's not for me.
Mm-hmm. No, that's good. Opposing answers.
I like it.
Mm-hmm. I do too. Well, where I'd love to start after our rousing round of Would You Rather, could each of you introduce yourself, your name, your role in the justice system, and then how that relates specifically to our conversation about human trafficking court today?
Sure. My name is Sarah Wolfson Butler. I'm an assistant district attorney here in Nashville, and I prosecute all of our promoting prostitution and human trafficking cases here. And I also staff our Cherished Hearts Court for survivors of human trafficking with Judge Escobar.
My name is Anna Escobar. I've been a lawyer a little bit over 25 years in Nashville. In 2018, I had the privilege of being elected to General Sessions. My day job is that I listen to domestic violence cases 3 months out of the year, but I also preside over Cherished Hearts, which, as Sarah said, is our human trafficking survivor court.
Great. So I'm going to pull way back for a second so we can just get context of human trafficking court. On a broad scale within our criminal justice system, there have been individual courts established that kind of help address social issues relating to crime, correct?
Correct.
Is that the right way to say that? Is there a better way to frame that concept?
I believe what we call them are treatment courts. So it's non-traditional way of looking at the judicial system and sentencing. So there are several treatment courts in Davidson County. We have Veterans Court, Mental Health Court. We have 2 or 3 addiction courts, recovery courts, and then ours.
Okay. And where does that fit in context with the traditional system?
So we are able to work with a participant, is what I call them.
Okay.
A participant for a longer extended period of time. In our case, it's 2 years. The great thing is we get to know the person. Usually at the beginning of the program, they come to court once a week, so we get to know what's happening in their lives, how their treatment's going. They are given the opportunity to go to addiction treatment. Once they're there, then they will transition to outpatient treatment, and then they start their trauma therapy. During that time, like I said, they are checking in with case managers, probation officers. We try to be as supportive as possible. Obviously, in a traditional court, it's more of a transactional thing, unfortunately. You come, if the case is proven by the state, you get sentenced, you're on probation, and not until something has gone wrong will you come back and see the judge. And the judge really never gets to know what's going on with the person, what their background was, what has brought them to the justice system.
And it's much longer. It also looks really different. I think you said you don't even wear a robe, right?
Correct. So we try to make it as trauma-informed as possible. We all sit around a table. I don't wear a robe. We usually try to do something fun to kick it off, either having cupcakes or having a speaker come, and then we get to the nitty-gritty of the business. We have about 8 team members, and they're all dispersed among the participants. So it's not, participants on one side and team members on another. We're all integrated together, and everyone's given a chance to speak, and we are able to provide feedback to the participant.
About how many participants are in? Is there a cap? Is there a number?
There is no cap. Our court has only been in existence for 3 years. And as you can imagine, with COVID and other situations, we've had some difficulties. We've not gotten as many applications because of COVID, but we have recently started accepting new applications, and we're excited to be screening more participants. But on average, we have about 10 participants.
Okay. Is this the only court in Tennessee?
We are the first. I believe, isn't there one that is combining human trafficking with mental health, I think? There's a hybrid out there.
But the concept of human trafficking court is rather new in this country, correct? When did they start getting formed, and how many are there across the country? Do you know?
So there, at the time that our Cherished Hearts Court was started, there were only, I think, 5 in the country that existed. So Ohio has always been kind of the leader of human trafficking response, although Tennessee has quickly taken that position. But the court in Ohio, I believe, is the oldest in the country. They have a human trafficking diversion court as well that functions, fairly similarly to ours. New York has one. I think Texas has one. But in terms of the kind of availability of these types of courts, they need to be more widespread than they are right now. Slowly but surely, I think that other states and jurisdictions are picking up on this need.
Yeah. What happens if there's somebody who is in trafficking but doesn't have a court system near them, doesn't have something like this that can help them? I mean, that kind of gets into referrals and how you get your participants. But are those people out of luck when it comes to things like that?
So in order to come to our court, you do have to have a criminal charge or probation violation for us to be able to accept you into the program.
I see.
So unfortunately, you do have to be involved in the criminal justice system.
And I would add that for surrounding counties, we have always been willing to work with their probation if someone in a surrounding county were to say to us, I have a woman on probation and I think she's being trafficked and I would like her to be supervised by Cherished Hearts Court, that's a conversation that we're certainly open to having because we understand that many of the smaller counties around may not have the ability or capacity to start an entire court like ours. But there are cities all over the country, like I said, who don't have access to this kind of court, and there are people who are being trafficked in all of those cities.
I will say that many of our participants are criminally involved in many jurisdictions, and I will applaud many of our surrounding counties will allow us to supervise the participant not only with our case, but the case in the other county. So they're trusting us to supervise. So I'm very pleased that they're open-minded and allow us to do that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Sarah, you had alluded to Ohio being the leader at one point and then transferring that to Tennessee, which we're very proud of that. But what makes the distinction? What was the change that happened?
Sure. So I would say, just to clarify, that's the rating that we've received from a global standpoint, that Tennessee has ranked number one in our response to human trafficking. But that doesn't mean that, other states are not also doing a fabulous job and may not have gotten there first. So Ohio, like I said, had, I think, the first, if not the biggest now, it's about 10 or 11 years old now, human trafficking diversion court. So again, the analysis of the states that are kind of leading in human trafficking response comes from a lot of different factors. And one of those factors, I would say, would be our diversion efforts. And Ohio certainly was the leader in that. And we actually had the privilege of going out to Ohio to visit their human trafficking court because we can always learn a lot from other states. But that said, we are very proud of everything that Tennessee has done to get us to that spot.
Yeah.
And by diversion, you are meaning when someone comes through the criminal justice system, being able to see that there could be trafficking going on and then getting them specifically into.
Exactly. So I call it a diversion court because it is diverting these criminally involved, currently women, we only take women right now, but it's diverting these criminally involved women away from jail or traditional probation and into a trauma-informed setting where we believe that we can provide the appropriate kind of support that would decrease recidivism rates and allow them to reenter into society. So when I use the word diversion, I mean diversion from traditional methods of prosecution and sentencing.
Okay. And you are the one who's actively looking at these cases and would be referring, is that a good word? Or you said applicants. What are the things you're looking for that would trigger a diversion into?
So I typically am actually not the one handling the cases of the women that we are screening for our court. Usually these women have charges that are not actually related to human trafficking or prostitution at all. Usually their charges are anything ranging from drug charges to thefts and burglaries, things like that. So I don't actually handle their cases, but I work closely with my office and with the defense bar and with judges, and so does Judge Escobar, to educate everybody who may be in contact with these defendants that could maybe get an inkling that they should be screened for Cherished Hearts. So we rely on, honestly, mostly the defense bar and my colleagues in the DA's office to get us those referrals.
Gotcha. What are the things that you're telling them to be looking for? Are there specific red flags that they should be looking for?
I have found that at that point, a defendant isn't speaking for themselves. They don't know what city they're in. They don't really have an explanation of where they live. They don't seem to have any of their own property. That's a huge red flag that something is happening, that they're not in control of their lives.
Right. And a huge amount of our referrals come out of, like I said, our general sessions courts and our domestic violence court. A lot of times a trafficker will come in maybe as a boyfriend, and the defendant could be, a female who's charged with assault. And the things that I would recommend that especially the people in my office look for are history. So we look at their criminal history, see if they have a criminal history of prostitution, could be a big indicator. See if they have a extensive out-of-county and out-of-state history. Have they moved around a lot? How did they get here? And also the type of charge is very informative. Oftentimes, if you read the warrant on these charges where there's a possible trafficking situation, it will be a intimate partner or somebody with a maybe much older male, or maybe the incident occurred at a motel or a hotel, or, this person had IDs on them that weren't theirs, things like that, that we look out for in criminal warrants as red flags that trafficking might be taking place.
Yeah. So prostitution's been brought up a few times, and I'd love to talk from a legal perspective about prostitution versus trafficking, because there are some crossovers when it comes to the background of the victim. A lot of them have similar backgrounds, pimp culture, runaway culture. Legally, where do those two things stand on their own? How are they different?
So the difference between, let's say, a promoting prostitution charge and a human trafficking charge would be force, fraud, and coercion, or a minor. So promoting prostitution is what I sort of like to refer to as like your everyday pimp, where he may buy a hotel room for a girl, he may drive her around in his car, but ultimately the female is in control and making the decision herself. And that is a time when we would actually charge, I'm using female because most of the time these are females, but there are male trafficking survivors, just to be clear. But just for this purpose, I'll use female. That is when we would charge a female with prostitution. If, that person is engaged in sex for money, but they are in control of that interaction. There may not be a promoter. Sometimes there's not kind of a pimp or somebody who's providing security involved. Sometimes it's just this woman on her own or man. But when we're talking about human trafficking, we're talking about somebody who's, yes, engaging in sex for money, but there's that element for adults of force, fraud, or coercion. And our statute is pretty extensive about what force, fraud, or coercion could look like. One of those things could be controlling access to controlled substances. So oftentimes a trafficker will control the behaviors of the survivor by controlling their access to a substance that they're addicted to. The legislator has enumerated that as a method of coercion. When there's a juvenile involved, it is always human trafficking. It used to be that there could be a juvenile prostitute. Those do not exist anymore. Kids cannot be prostitutes. They cannot be charged with prostitution. Anytime that somebody is engaging in sex for a benefit with a minor, that is human trafficking.
And what year did that change?
So the legislation sort of started to shift about 10 years ago. Over the course of maybe, I would say, 2010 to 2016, there was a lot of development in our human trafficking laws, especially as they relate to minors.
Okay. So let's say someone is in human trafficking court, but also had drug charges, or there might be other things at play, mental health. Can there be multiple courts that are involved at the same time?
So we are lucky to have a team that has somebody from the mental health co-op sitting there. We have somebody who knows about recovery, trauma, and the case managers or social workers who are very informed. So within our court, if a person needs mental health treatment, they have a liaison through the mental health co-op, and they will get the person the care and medications that they need. So there's not that need to go from court to court. Same with the recovery. We try to get them, as I said, into inpatient treatment and then outpatient treatment and any follow-up that needs to be done. And then we have our own therapists through the sexual assault center that meet with the client once a week. So we hope to house all those things in one place.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about the program and the sorts of things that go into Cherished Hearts. In our first season, we had an episode featuring someone who was a volunteer at the John School.
The John School is for people who have been charged with soliciting prostitution. So that is an A misdemeanor now. It used to be a B misdemeanor. We're not necessarily saying that people who attend the John School are perpetrators of human trafficking. If that were the case, we would prosecute them for human trafficking. But they are typically men who have sought sex for money, and we want to address that issue and the underlying needs for why that was happening as well.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't make sense to address supply unless you're also going to address demand.
Right, exactly. So what is that? Is it a day? Is it a weekend? What does it look like?
Sure. So John School is held on scattered Saturdays, once a month or so. The woman who runs it is wonderful. I speak at the John School about the laws, about culpability. And also one of the things that I highlight to the men in the John School is that it is not a pretty woman scenario. There is probably a 0% chance that the woman who they have just paid to have sex with them wants to be there. And so we just try to burst their bubble. And also, again, we sort of have speakers that can address their underlying issues. Why were you going out to seek sex from a stranger? And I do also make it very clear to them that patronizing prostitution is very dangerous. They could be killed, robbed, beaten. It's not a walk in the park for anybody if you're going to engage in high-risk activity. So that class costs them $375. All of that money goes back to Thistle Farms, and they have to also get I believe, a mandatory STD test. And then once they complete the class, we will dismiss and expunge that charge. But they only have one shot to do it. So if they're caught again soliciting prostitution, then we will address that via jail or probation.
Have you seen any success stories, or what kind of success stories have you seen come out of this?
It's hard to track success of the John School, although I will say the recidivism rate is very, very low in terms of we don't usually see return customers, if you will. Usually once someone has attended the John School, we are not seeing them pop up again as soliciting prostitution. I have had a man or two approach me and tell me, that the class had a massive impact on them, that they just weren't aware of oftentimes the trauma of the person that they were going to try to buy. They weren't aware of X, Y, and Z. They weren't aware of why they even wanted to do this, and that this class had some kind of big impact on them. So that's always nice to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's a fantasy that I think people think about prostitution and about that experience. And you're telling them the truth. You're trying to make sure that they understand, hey, this is not a fantasy. It is, it's their fantasy, but it's not the truth.
Stacy and I talked about Pretty Woman specifically in prepping for this interview. It was a bit of a rabbit trail, but it was a great conversation.
I find myself referencing movies a lot when I'm talking about human trafficking and prostitution.
Mm-hmm.
The way that we portray the commercial sex industry in film and on television is damaging. It's created a narrative where I do think that glamorizing it causes issues, especially for men who are seeking that. I also think that the dramatic way that human trafficking is portrayed is extremely damaging. So kind of on both ends, there's so much media surrounding this issue that has kind of made reality slip away for people who are involved in it. And that's, again, why education is so important. We cannot take Liam Neeson's word for what human trafficking looks like.
I was just going to bring up Taken. I mean, I feel as though there is a sort of battle with media for truth. There's part of why this show exists, to tell real stories, so that you're more often hearing real stories than you are watching Taken and seeing people who are swept up into vans and sold into trafficking.
Absolutely. And it all goes back to what's palatable for people. And the more that we marginalize survivors who don't have the Taken story, the worse off we are as a community at curbing human trafficking, because we're not acknowledging what the real stories look like. And again, when we're seeing all of this on the media, and then I tell you this very real story of a survivor here, but she had access to a cell phone, she wasn't injected with heroin, and she certainly wasn't swept into a white van in Russia, it is harder for people to stomach that, to make that palpable for them, to be able to say that this person is as much of a victim and a survivor as Liam Neeson's fictional daughter. So I think, again, you're right. It's a struggle with how this is portrayed. And I hope that at some point, maybe we can have some more realistic imagery.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
I think there's also a big, this wouldn't happen to me or my family element of things. And escapism is such a huge part of our media these days, and, our television and our movies that we choose to watch. So basically telling somebody, like, let's put on a movie about like some very foreign trafficking incident that would never happen in our backyard, people are like, oh yeah, for sure. But you say, like, let's put on a film that like really highlights the struggles of trafficking here locally, it's like, meh, I don't know if I want to watch that. So a lot of it is just addressing what people want to see, what's interesting to people versus what is reality.
Well, and we've talked about intersectionality and culpability. I think one of the things that makes Taken so great for people is it's these middle-class girls that are just going off to have a fun time and they've been completely swept up, whereas the reality is, no, there's so much more at play. Drugs, domestic violence. And I think it's hard for people to look at all of it and still really care about the issue.
Exactly. Trafficking is so reliant on vulnerability. So whatever that vulnerability looks like, traffickers are adept to picking out people who have pre-existing vulnerabilities, whether that be a runaway juvenile with an unstable home life, a woman who may have a prior addiction, or a woman who they could get easily addicted, somebody who is in the criminal justice system. That is a vulnerability. Once you're involved in the criminal justice system, that is something that a trafficker can hold over somebody's head.
You mean to say like probation, or explain that a little bit?
Well, so let's take a woman again. So there are situations where a woman may have been arrested. There are a couple of avenues in which this would make this woman more vulnerable. One of those avenues is her bond. Maybe a man that she's close to makes her bond and he has her work to pay that bond off. That's a vulnerability that has led to her trafficking. Another one is, let's say she goes to jail or to prison. She gets out. She can't find an apartment. She can't find a job. She can't find any stability. And she meets somebody who says, well, I can give you stability. Here's some drugs and that'll make this work easier. You go out and work. And she does it for a while, but doesn't want to. Well, guess what? You're not leaving. Trafficking. So again, these are just examples, but it's exactly what you were saying. It's not usually this just, middle-class gal with a wonderful upbringing, although that does happen.
It happens, yeah.
It's usually somebody who has a vulnerability that's existing that a trafficker is preying on, which again marginalizes these survivors from our community in, a million ways, that they feel that they're not worthy of the help that we try to give them. And that's a whole other spiral.
Yeah. Well, I know in this work, we've found that a lot of survivors for a long time don't even recognize that they've been trafficked.
Oftentimes when a trafficker is arrested and charged with trafficking, especially when I have a juvenile victim, it is challenging to get that victim to acknowledge that what happened to them was trafficking. Typically, they're not ready to go there. And that's okay. It just takes time. Another area that I see this all of the time is in our Grace Empowered class, which is our class for women who have been charged with prostitution. Similar to the John School, our Grace Empowered class is a one-day class meant to address the underlying issues and, again, vulnerabilities of these women who have been charged with prostitution. And once they complete the class, we'll dismiss and expunge that prostitution charge. So I run that Grace Empowered class, and it's every single class that I see women who it'll be raise your hand if you've ever associated with a pimp, raise your hand if that pimp has ever made you go out when you didn't want to, raise your hand if that pimp has ever controlled your access to drugs. 99% of the time, these women are raising their hand. But then I'll say, well, how many of you see that as human trafficking? 0. It's just a lack of, it's a total lack of knowledge.
Yeah, and the word pimp, I think that's in some ways a loaded word, because I think what my understanding with the survivors of human trafficking, the victims of human trafficking, they may call that person boyfriend instead of pimp.
Yes.
And so when you say that, they're like, no, I'm not trafficked. That's my boyfriend. I'm just doing what I have to do.
Exactly. So the word pimp I would never interchange trafficker with pimp. A pimp to me is, like I said, somebody who's promoting prostitution, where there's not force, fraud, or coercion involved. Once they move into, people have all kinds of names like guerrilla pimps, things that indicate violence. To me, that's a trafficker. And I don't want to call them anything different, because I think, again, due to the media, there's, for many people, this like glory about the word pimp, especially from rappers and Ludacris and Snoop Dogg or whatever. And I don't want to glorify trafficking. So when I use the word pimp, I really am talking about somebody who may not engage in force, fraud, or coercion. And that oftentimes does resonate with the women, especially who have been charged with prostitution, who would be very willing to say, yeah, I have a pimp, but not willing to say, yeah, I have a trafficker. And even when they have been told what trafficking is and how what this person did does qualify as trafficking, they will say, and I hear this over and over, no, he's just a pimp, he's just a pimp, he's just a pimp. It is very hard to get a victim or a survivor who is not ready to be able to confront the word trafficking or the word trafficker. They're fine most of the time with the word pimp.
So what is your immediate response when they say, no, that's just my pimp?
It depends on the situation that I'm in. You know, if we're working in a court situation where they're a victim on a criminal charge, where we're charging the trafficker with trafficking, I will do my best to walk them through the law, clarify it for them. And also connecting them to services is really the most important, because no matter how much I talk at them about what human trafficking is, it's not until they get in with y'all at End Slavery or Thistle or, Office of Family Safety, and they sit down with somebody who can dissect the trauma a little bit more, that they're ever going to say that this person was my trafficker. So sometimes I just don't push it. Sometimes I just let them use what they're comfortable with.
Yeah. I love that this is a 2-year program, because it does take time to process all of that trauma and to acknowledge any type of trauma. That is the process of having to face it. So it's a huge thing. And that you've developed this core. I'm still kind of astounded that this is a court system, and all my images of what court looks like, it does not look like sitting around a table with a balance of professionals who are there to not prosecute and harm you, but to actually support your recovery. I'm astounded.
My 2 supervisors who created the court were very in tune with the needs of these women. And the fact is, there's so much benefit to these women being able to sit down with people that they usually consider scary or law enforcement, me as a prosecutor and judge as a judge, people who they're usually very not willing to speak to be able to have a team of people that includes people that they consider law enforcement is, I think, hugely beneficial in its own way. It's saying we care, first of all, not just because we have to, but because we do. And I think a big part of it is we are here to help, and let us show you that rather than tell you that. And I think that kind of solidifies more of a trust, I guess, in law enforcement, which again decreases their vulnerability to being re-trafficked in their future if they feel that they can trust law enforcement.
Mm-hmm. Grace Empowered, Stacy, you have a really great story that kind of plays into that trust thing that I would love if you shared.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to attend Grace Empowered, and there was basically a room full of people. They'd had the prostitution charges, and they were there to attend a program. And one by one, the different service providers in Nashville would come forth and tell a story and just tell their point of view. So somebody from public health talked about sexually transmitted diseases. And while we were in this class, they actually got tested for that. And I just served coffee and food. I just paid attention. And I remember when the public health nurse was saying, I'm going to take everybody's blood, there was one particular woman who kind of cringed a little bit, and she was like, ooh, I'm nervous about that. And that is exactly my reaction to such a thing. So we had a little break, and during the break, I went over to her and I said, look, if you want somebody to go with you while you're doing the blood, because I get it, I'll hold your hand or something. And she said, please do come with me. And I said, okay. So when she left, I did. I held her hand and went back in. And here's my favorite part of the story, because this is what I know that I built the trust. Later on in the day, one of the people, I don't know if she was from End Slavery or Thistle or even somebody from the Human Trafficking Court, came up to me and said, hey, I just want you to know, one of the people in this program over here pointed at you and said, hey, is that a recovering hoe? Talking about me.
You made it then.
Right? And that's what we're trying to do here at End Slavery, Tennessee, is to build the kind of trust so that the people that we want to serve say, hey, you understand me. You get it. And I'm willing to trust you because I think you understand where I'm coming from. So to me, that's the biggest compliment of all. I'm not sorry at all to say that I'm not a recovering hoe, but I'm so I'm so happy that it's one of the pinnacle moments of my experience here is to know that I did identify and help someone. That's just the best.
And what I love about that story is that there's so much culture in that phrase that she said, using the word hoe. I've come to learn in these interviews that there's this nomenclature, there's this system for what you call your fellow people who are doing this work with you.
Lay sisters is a big one.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. And again, that's why a lot of people say that there's like a particular vernacular. You're supposed to use some particular verbiage surrounding, human trafficking. And you're supposed to say this or you're not supposed to say that. And I think a lot of people would disagree with me using the word pimp at all. But I have found after my couple years working specifically with survivors and with women who have been charged with prostitution, it is important to meet them where they're at. And sometimes that's just using the words that they're comfortable using and not trying to get on your high horse and be all high and mighty and talk, a certain way at them, but instead just meet them where they're at and talk with them. And that's why, especially in our Grace Empowered class, I say it's a no judgment zone. You can curse in here, say what you want. No one is here to judge what you are doing. That's not what we're here for. Tell your story. We're not here to shame you. This very marginalized group of women, these women who have been charged with prostitution, most of whom are still very high risk living on the street, who really feel a lot of shame surrounding what they're doing. We very rarely have women go straight from our Grace Empowered class to some kind of safe housing or rehab. We offer it, but that very rarely happens. And that's okay. Our whole thing with our Grace Empowered class is that we plant the seed. We say, here's a whole bunch of people who really care. And if you're ready, when you're ready to get off the street and leave this life, you can come and find us. And here's where. A little different from our Cherished Hearts program, where again, the women are criminally involved. So we are asking them to participate at that moment in time. Our Grace Empowered class is very much a seed planting endeavor. Just here's, where things stand. And I still will see women come through court who have been in Grace Empowered and they'll know my name and they'll ask me for help and, ask me where to go and I'll call who I need to call and it will happen again and again. But the point is they know we're out there. They know people like Stacy come in and actually really care enough to go and hold their hand, not to just sit there and stare at them or judge them.
What are some highlights from the last 10 years that have happened in legislation?
Sure. So a big one was getting Backpage shut down. I mean, there are still websites like Backpage, but Backpage was just a massive culprit of human trafficking. So getting Backpage shut down was a huge step in curbing the supply and demand nexus. But beyond that, a lot of the legislative changes have come with, number one, in regards to juveniles and how we handle juvenile survivors of trafficking, and number two, what we're going to actually constitute as human trafficking. So again, I mentioned earlier that there is now this piece in the human trafficking statute that acknowledges access to a controlled substance as a form of coercion. That's fairly new. That's something that has come up in numerous ways and has now made its way into the actual law. How we handle juveniles is, I think, probably the biggest change, because it used to be that a juvenile could be charged with prostitution, and the statute was patronizing or promoting prostitution of a minor. And while it still exists that there is still a promoting prostitution of a minor, patronizing prostitution of a minor statute, we really don't use them anymore because all commercial sex with a minor now falls under human trafficking. We no longer charge minors with prostitution. There is no such thing as a juvenile prostitute. So it is taking time to get that verbiage changed, where even sometimes I'll have, law enforcement will get up and say, well, this 15-year-old was prostituting. Well, no, she wasn't. 15-year-old is a trafficking survivor. So we're going to approach it that way. Doesn't matter to me that the 15-year-old was doing a bunch of drugs. She's a kid. So that has been a huge shift in how we address juveniles. Another big shift is the services that we provide survivors. There is a brand new expungement law that is specific to survivors of human trafficking. So there's, the general expungement law where you can wait 5 years and there's a list of charges that you can expunge after 5 years. The human trafficking expungement law, you can petition after 1 year. It has a couple of elements of it that make it a little bit unworkable, and that's something I'm actually really passionate about working on right now with some advocacy and lobbyists, that we are hoping to get this law changed to be more workable. But it's so cool that it even exists. It's amazing to see how now we are acknowledging, again, that gray area between culpability and victimhood, and acknowledging that survivors of human trafficking need our support retroactively for charges that they may have been picked up while they were being trafficked.
The first one was actually in season 1. We had a survivor who was charged with prostitution, but it was a trafficking situation. She was HIV positive, and she's on a list of, I think she said, a couple of dozen other women who are automatically on the child predator list. What do you know about that? What's at play there?
Nowadays, if we are acknowledging, as we are much more broadly, that this, let's say this woman was being trafficked, we would not have ever charged her with prostitution. Mm-hmm. If we suspect that somebody is being trafficked, law enforcement nowadays are trained to call for services instead of arresting for something like a prostitution charge or an aggravated prostitution charge. The goal is not to charge a victim. And the detectives, I will say, Agent Wilkerson with the TBIs, who I work with, and then the detectives over at Metro Nashville, who are specifically assigned to trafficking cases. First of all, it is a huge deal that we have this new human trafficking unit over at Metro Nashville Police Department. Again, an acknowledgement of the fact that this is real, that it's happening, and that it deserves our attention. But second of all, those detectives who are in that unit are wonderful. I mean, they're incredibly dedicated. They understand what they're looking for and what they're looking at. And it's something I hope that we can extend to patrol officers, because once you get the detectives involved, I feel, you're pretty rest assured that the right things are going to happen. So
I think it takes a while for a survivor to disclose. And so if we can have as many points of entry for that survivor to be able to disclose, they may not disclose to that police officer that they encounter, but maybe they'll disclose to their attorney or victim advocate. Then if we can have those layers of points of entry, then hopefully those people can have access to the services that are currently available in Tennessee.
So our conversation with Cyntoia Brown, whose case was popularized in recent years. In 2006, she was convicted first-degree murder of a man who solicited her for sex when she was 16. She was actually granted clemency in 2019 from Bill Haslam. Lots of popular conversation about this. There's been a lot of legislation enacted since then. So I don't want to ask, how would Cyntoia's case be different? But if there were a 16-year-old now who are in a similar situation, what might be at play? What has changed legally that wasn't at play in 2006?
So again, I would just say that the legislation that we have now that surrounds how we approach human trafficking, both for survivors and also surrounding crimes that occur because of human trafficking, so much has changed in that realm that it's impossible to even compare what the climate was in 2006 surrounding human trafficking, when we really hadn't even scratched the surface of understanding that it was even happening here. We just have so much more by way of resources, by way of intervention, education. And I feel like at this point we're intervening, or at least we're doing our best to intervene with at-risk youth before they reach the point that, they're so ingrained in a trafficking situation that something so horrific and violent happens. So again, we're certainly not perfect, but compared to 2006, we have made leaps and bounds in how we can provide support for at-risk youth.
And the episode actually the week before Cyntoia is talking about at-risk youth and juvenile vulnerability. And it's very interesting to see that there are a number of factors that you can see that early on in a child's life. And if you're able to step in, there could be some prevention.
Yeah.
Social media and the connection of a child to a phone. Parents really need to educate themselves on what their child is doing on that phone. There's so many apps that none of us really understand or what they're doing on those apps, who they're meeting on those apps, what those people are asking them to do on those apps. And so, there's so many layers to this, but parents educating themselves on what their children are holding in their hand that could lead to opening doors that they never imagined.
Well, there was that video that Bark released of the undercover agent who they made her a fake profile and they photoshopped her to look like she was 11. And that sort of live reporting. And I even know I have a sister in her 20s and she'll just post, and the amount of messages she gets from sugar daddies and people who are vulnerable.
Right.
Will
respond.
Respond because they don't have systems of protection. They need family. They need validation.
Yeah, and I think also it's been really interesting for us to look, coming from the Cherished Hearts angle of all of our participants are obviously adults, but we in our screener, have questions about childhood traumas, like 99%.
I was shocked, honestly, in doing this work, how many parents traffic their child.
Oh, yeah.
And trying to ask this person to cut out their persons, places, or things, which is part of recovery. It's almost impossible when it's a parent that you're trying to cut out. There's so many emotions and traumas there. It's unbelievable. So it's so difficult.
That reminds me, I love that the human trafficking court is focused on victim identification and healing. But the victims are only a small piece of the puzzle of the big picture of human trafficking. There's the person who is being victimized, but there's also the perpetrators of the crime. And it's really money. It's money that's the driver, the demand you talked a little bit about. But then there's, how are we prosecuting the traffickers, which sometimes it sounds like might be a parent. That is a very complex dynamic that you've brought up. But I know that we do have to prosecute traffickers for their crimes. What does that look like?
I have a case currently that is a parent and a juvenile. It is a mother and a daughter. And it has been one of my most challenging cases by far because, like you said, that dynamic of a person who's in a position of trust it's just horrific. One of the things that I try to do, especially when it's family involved, and again, I have a parent and a child, but that's not the only family case that I have. I have husbands and wives. I have nieces and aunts. I have a ton of family relationships that, again, someone is being charged with trafficking. The best thing that I try to do is give the victims some level of autonomy in how this goes forward. And while that's not always possible, if they say, I want this whole thing dismissed and I want nothing to do with it, that's obviously not going to happen. But in terms of my options in prosecuting, one of the things that I try to encourage is maybe we have a sentencing hearing instead of going to trial. So maybe I work out a plea agreement with the defense attorney that prevents this kid from having to testify against her mom, but she's still able to make a statement about what happened to her at sentencing. Sort of feeling out where that victim will feel comfortable with her role in what happened, and also understanding that my prosecution in these particular cases has to be more victim-centered than maybe I'm even used to, or maybe even than sometimes I'm comfortable with, because I have to honor, especially when I have juveniles who may have been trafficked by somebody in a position of authority or close relationship, I have to honor that relationship and how this victim is going to be impacted for the rest of their life. So it's just important to give, to me at least, the victim as much autonomy as I can during that process.
So, final question. How are traffickers being held responsible in the state of Tennessee, and where do you see that really coming into play?
So like I said, our human trafficking laws right now are really comprehensive. So what's great is that we are really able to charge people who deserve to be charged with human trafficking, and the barriers of defining human trafficking are becoming less and less because the statute has become so much more comprehensive. Human trafficking is a B felony on its face. There are also enhancing factors if it happens within 1,000 feet of a school or a park, if the juvenile is under 15 years old. And then it bumps it up to an A felony. Also, it's mandatory sex offender registration. So is promoting prostitution. That sex offender registration is extremely stringent. It's very hard to complete, so it definitely keeps people in line. Like I said, our legislation is very comprehensive. So what that allows me to do is to really look at the scale of culpability and victimhood where that exists, or it also allows me to look at the scale of severity of the crime. And I usually am able to make some kind of case. Now, I say that with pause because when it's not a juvenile and I have to prove force, fraud, or coercion, if I have a victim who drops off and no longer wants to participate in prosecution, they become extremely challenging to prosecute. It is extremely challenging to prove that somebody was forced or coerced to do something without that person there to say that they were forced or coerced to do something. Usually, circumstantial evidence can go so far, but especially if I have to take something in front of a jury, which it rarely happens because it's very hard to do, to take these to a jury trial. With that said, the fact that my office has even had a dedicated prosecutor do this shows how seriously my office takes human trafficking as a crime. And the fact that we are acknowledging the seriousness of it means that we are willing to prosecute it to our fullest extent. And that is what we do.
When you said it's difficult to prosecute without the testimony of a victim, I mean, to me, that just, the trauma involved in that process is remarkable. I can't imagine what it must be like for someone who's been victimized, especially if it's the familial. It's almost asking too much.
These prosecutions typically take a very long time, usually like 1.5 to 2 years, to get from the place of where somebody was charged to the place of where we're either looking at a plea or looking at a jury trial. The good part of that is that it does give the victim some space from their trauma, some opportunity to get the help and work through that so that if they do have to testify, hopefully they're in a better place than they were at the moment that their trafficker was arrested. I do a ton of education for myself about victimless prosecution. So it's not impossible. How do you say to a jury, like, she was coerced to do this, but she's not here to tell you how?
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about movies portraying things, and in a movie, the victim is empowered and
Right.
wins, and the bad guy goes to jail. But it rarely looks like that.
Well, it certainly doesn't look like that on the scale of like efficiency that they make it look like in the movies. Like, in Law and Order, when they're like, well, we've arrested this person and the jury trial is tomorrow. Like, that just is not.
In one episode.
Yeah, in one episode. That's just a wholly unrealistic expectation of our criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. And beyond that, it's just the way that the media, TV shows, and movies portray the things that attorneys are allowed to do in court is just so unrealistic. One example I can think of is I have a survivor who I'm working with who it was her husband who was trafficking her, and she wants me to be able to tell the court about the 90 other times that he abused her over the course of their life. But she never filed police reports. I don't have anything that, I can use as a way to admit that into court as testimony. It's just her saying that these things happen. And while I would love to be able to have her testify about every single thing that this person has ever done to her, I can't. But in the movies,
Yeah, it's not about not believing her. It's about, in court, it not being...
It's not admissible.
Mm-hmm. Ugh, that's tough.
So yeah, again, that's just another false expectation that we have surrounding how our criminal justice system works, and especially in trafficking cases. We are limited. We can only do what we can do.
Yeah.
This has just been so incredibly helpful because getting things from a legal perspective is just so important, because part of fighting this crime is a battle in a court of law. And so having your perspective, Anna, Sarah, thank you so much for taking your afternoon on a very, very busy day to talk with us. This has been a joy.
We really appreciate it. We love talking about Cherished Hearts. It's a big part of our lives, and we absolutely love the work. So thank you for giving us this platform.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
You're welcome. Additional information about the intersectionality of crime and trafficking can be found on this episode's page at inslaverytn.org/podcast. In Slavery Tennessee thanks the Jones Legacy Group for their continued support of Someone Like Me. Our production staff is Gregory Byerline, Stacy Elliot, and Marissa Brunell. Claire Bidigary Curtis is our engineer, and original music is by Zach and Maggie White. I'm Leslie Eiler Thompson. Thank you for listening.